All right, let's dive right into an explainer on the 2026 crisis that completely transformed the global economy and geopolitics. We're going to look at the exact moment the world's most critical maritime artery was severed, sending absolute shockwaves through literally every nation on Earth. So, what actually happens when 20% of the world's oil just stops moving overnight? Well, that's exactly the nightmare scenario the world was forced to answer in March of 2026. Just imagine turning on the news to find out that a fifth of the world's lifeblood, the energy that powers our cities, our supply chains, our daily lives, has suddenly been trapped behind an invisible wall of asymmetrical warfare.
The immediate answer? $126. That was the peak price for a single barrel of Brent crude oil as absolute chaos gripped the global markets. It was the largest and fastest disruption to the global energy supply since the 1970s oil crises. But, to truly understand the sheer scale of this shock, we have to look at the geography.
Section 1, Anatomy of a Choke Point. To really understand how we got here, we first need to zoom in on the physical landscape of the conflict itself. What's truly staggering is just how unbelievably narrow this physical bottleneck is for such a massive chunk of our global energy supply. We're talking about a mere 21-mile gap between Oman and Iran. Through this tiny, tiny blue thread passes 25% of all seaborne oil and 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas. It is, for sure, the ultimate geographic vulnerability.
And the escalation from military strikes to a full-blown economic freeze was just unbelievably rapid. On February 28th, U.S. and Israeli strikes hit Iranian targets, which resulted in the death of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. Within literal hours, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps began warning ships away. By March 2nd, the closure was official. By March 4th, maritime traffic had plummeted to near zero, and just a few days later, oil surged way past $100 a barrel.
By mid-April, there were 20,000 seafarers trapped in the Persian Gulf, alongside roughly 2,000 stranded ships. I mean, really think about that for a second. 20,000 human beings just caught in this sort of floating purgatory, completely unable to navigate their way out of the crossfire. Section 2, the dual naval blockade. So, how exactly do you shut down an entire ocean? It's not a physical wall, but rather a terrifying gauntlet of asymmetrical warfare. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps utilized these highly disruptive, totally hard-to-defend methods. They didn't need a fleet of massive destroyers to close the strait, right? Instead, they laid undetectable sea mines, deployed these swarms of explosive drone boats, jammed GPS signals so ships literally couldn't navigate, and used swarms of armed speedboats for direct vessel seizures. This strategy sent insurance premiums skyrocketing by thousands of percent, which effectively scared off all commercial traffic. But remember, these aren't just statistics. These are real human tragedies that show the absolute sheer danger faced by these international shipping crews trying to navigate the blockade. Take the Skylight, for instance, an oil tanker that was abandoned after 2 crew members were killed, or the tugboat Musafa II, which sank, leaving 4 dead. And, it wasn't just industrial vessels caught up in this either. The Mindshift 4, an actual civilian cruise ship carrying tourists, was explicitly threatened with destruction over the radio. The Guardian aptly called this a dual blockade, which created this massive maritime stalemate, where both sides were actively restricting movement based on political alliances. Basically, Iran blocked the strait to Western allies, but they allowed non-aligned nations to pass if they paid a staggering $2 million toll. And in response, the U.S. Navy blockaded Iranian ports and actually began intercepting any vessel that dared to pay that Iranian toll. The result was literally absolute gridlock. Section 3, the global economic shock. Let's zoom out for a minute and look at the massive economic squeeze gripping the entire globe as a direct result of this military standoff. Instantly losing a quarter of the world's seaborne oil triggered the single largest energy supply disruption since the 1970s. And this wasn't just a slowdown, okay? 25% of the global supply was suddenly and violently severed from the market. That led to an absolute scramble for reserves and a historic release of emergency stockpiles by the International Energy Agency. And the immediate shock to Europe was just devastating. Natural gas prices literally doubled in a matter of days, jumping from 30 euros per megawatt hour to a peak of 60. Think about that. When the Strait of Hormuz closes, heating homes and running factories in Europe instantly becomes twice as expensive overnight. So The absolutely crucial point to take away here is that this crisis impacted far more than just what you pay at the gas pump. It threatened global food supplies, manufacturing, international travel, you name it. For example, the Gulf produces 30% of the world's urea fertilizer exports, and all of it was suddenly trapped. Aluminum prices surged. Even global helium supplies had to be actively rationed because Qatar's liquefied natural gas exports were shut down. Literally every single corner of the global economy felt this pinch. Section 4. Oman's fragile neutrality. Finally, let's zoom back in to the narrowest choke point of them all, the incredibly fragile diplomatic back channel that was holding the absolute key to peace. Oman is geographically located right in the middle of the crossfire. They share the physical strait with Iran, yet they desperately try to maintain an open diplomatic channel. Now, in the Middle East, Oman has long operated on this sort of friend-to-all, enemy-to-none doctrine. But as you can imagine, staying neutral when you share a 21-mile border with an active war zone, that's incredibly difficult. Oman was living this incredible paradox every single day. They were taking direct military fire while simultaneously acting as the primary mediator. See, because Oman hosts U.S. military logistics at its ports, Iranian drones actually began striking Omani facilities like Duqm and Salalah. And tragically, those strikes resulted in 14 civilian deaths. Yet, astonishingly, Oman still refused to join the anti-Iran Gulf coalition. They opted instead to keep that critical diplomatic door open.
So Oman's neutrality was being tested from all sides. But here is a wild economic twist for you. Because Oman is the only Gulf state whose export ports sit outside the Strait of Hormuz, the crisis actually became a massive economic windfall for them. Their crude oil was trading at a staggering $50 premium over Brent, simply because buyers could actually physically get to it without crossing the blockade.
Despite the attacks on their own soil, Oman's leadership remains steadfastly committed to diplomacy, basically offering the only viable off-ramp to a total regional war. Oman's foreign minister, Badr al-Busaidi, pushed heavily for peace. He kept insisting that the so-called Muscat Channel, which was the same back channel used previously for the 2015 nuclear deal, remained the absolute best hope for the world. But as the death toll rises and allies demand unity, Sultan Haytham bin Tariq faced just immense pressure to abandon his friend-to-all doctrine. It's a classic rock and a hard place. On one side, Gulf allies in the U.S. are pressuring Oman to join a collective defense posture. And on the exact opposite side, countries like India and Bangladesh are demanding action because those 14 civilians killed in the Omani port strikes, they were almost entirely South Asian immigrant workers. If Oman gets pushed off the fence, whether by a stray strike or just overwhelming political pressure, the only diplomatic corridor left between the warring parties completely collapses. In geopolitics, neutrality is often a luxury that small states simply can't afford. But Oman deeply understands that if they formally enter the war, the one room where the enemies can actually talk, well, it disappears completely. So we leave you with this final thought. As the entire global economy hangs in the balance, can Oman actually survive the crossfire long enough to broker a lasting peace? If there's one thing you should take away from this explainer, it's just how deeply, deeply interconnected our world really is. I mean, it's wild to think how a 21-mile stretch of water and the incredibly delicate diplomacy of a single neutral nation can literally dictate the cost of the food on your table and the stability of the entire global economy. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep asking the big questions.